We're going to look now closer at each of these areas and start reviewing the types of learning disability, looking at specific language disorder, um, and breaking it down into language deficits and different types of emotional and behavioral disorders. We're asking this question: is there a difference in what kind of language disorders are associated with each type of an emotional or behavioral disorder? And it's kind of a mixed bag. There's not really a clear line. We just know from the research at this point that we can't make any assumptions because some studies have shown receptive language disorders. Remember, that's would be what they can understand through auditory language listening and through reading. And some studies show that that is more prevalent in this population, and others have shown expressive language, speaking, writing disorders are more prevalent. And then a recent study showed that combined receptive and expressive language disorders were the most prevalent. So basically, there's research at this point for all three. So then we'd have to go back and really consider the limitations and the methodology of those research papers to try and understand, okay, what can we do next to research this and get a better answer? So really, there is evidence to support all areas. And so it's going to be crucial that you're using your best professional judgment and that you really have to avoid making any assumptions. When we talk about a specific language disorders, most studies find deficits in nearly every aspect of language in a student who is emotionally and behaviorally disordered. And their most challenging aspects that are noted are their grammatical functioning. So that would be in not only how they speak, it'd be in how they imitate. If you ask them to repeat a sentence, could they repeat it using the correct grammar? And how they write, obviously. And then pragmatic language, which is not overly surprising that if they had a very unique emotional or behavior problems that they were displaying, it would lead to issues with social skills. Specifically, they have a hard time with maintaining the topic. They might demonstrate inappropriate responses, and they fail to adequately consider the needs of the listener, which just kind of goes along with the other things. They don't necessarily care. I shouldn't say it like that. They don't necessarily look like they care about what the person thinks is important, how the conversation's going, if the listener's getting a turn to talk, if the listener thinks what they're saying is okay. So, yeah, it's not a surprise, but those are kind of the most challenging aspects to date that we know in this population. Further answering that question, we look at two type of behavioral disorders: an internalized behavior disorder, and that would manifest itself in looking like withdrawal and depression. So that's going to lead to those pragmatic issues because social interaction is difficult when you're by yourself. And we know social interaction is a key contributor to language development. So then all those other things come into play at being at a great risk for language difficulties because of that lack of social interaction or the difficulty in having typical ones. Then there's the externalized behavior disorder, and I think this is what people most commonly associate when they hear about a child labeled or identified as EBD. And those are those behaviors that are aggression, usually very disruptive behaviors, and hyperactivity. And that's where we would see more trouble with expressive language. And if we just think about this logically, if you are really angry, it kind of depends on your stress response. Some people are fighters versus flight, so they don't have a hard time speaking, but they still might feel so flustered that it's hard for them to even get the right words out. And then the other half that might is more like, wants to run away or just freezes, they have problems with expressive language in those moments too. So if you're in a moment in a state of aggression and hyperactivity, difficulty focusing, it would make sense that it would be hard to get your thoughts out through speaking or writing. I want you to go and look at this website, and I want you to look specifically at a few. I want you to at least look at what the information says about anxiety and about depression and about suicide. Especially talking about anxiety and depression in young children, research shows that if they have one, anxiety or depression, that they are most certainly going to have the other. And so I think that those things are really important because I think we're seeing that more. And I don't know that everyone realizes that it's pretty much always co occurring, especially in young children. And that's what the research shows right now. So I want you to look at these. I want you to consider the possible language disorder after reading, the information on anxiety or depression or suicidal thoughts, ideation. And I want you to think of how could this affect a person's expressive language and how could it affect a person's receptive language. Sorry, my PowerPoint keeps getting all wonky. Moving along, we're going to look specifically at what literacy skills might look like in this population. In the area of reading, the prevalence of underachievement in children with EBD has a giant range, but ranges from 31% to 81%. And there's a couple things. It could come from their difficulties with language, but we know if a child has disruptive behaviors that aren't managed through their environment, if we can't give them replacement behaviors and kind of get them successful to stay in the classroom, they miss so much class time. They miss, so much instruction time that it makes sense there's between those factors there's going to be this gap. And then that leads to other things because what research shows is that a low reading achievement is associated with a greater risk for psychiatric disorders. And we already know, aside from EBD, that if a child has a language impairment, they are 6 times more likely to have a reading difficulty period. So there's just a lot kind of going against them. 50% of children and 36% of adolescents have writing scores below average. But we know reading difficulties are a major contributor to writing. So it makes sense that would be they have problems with reading, they'd have problems with writing. And then that ability to self-monitor and self-regulate is usually, what do I want to say, decreased. And so it makes it hard. It makes writing much more challenging to kind of stay on topic as you're writing. But the good news is when it comes to actual instructional methods, the literature is saying, hey, they can be just as responsive. It's not okay to assume that they can't be. You just have to know them well enough, their specific emotional or behavior problem, to know which reading instruction tool would best benefit them. But it's not impossible for them to get appropriate reading instruction. And then, like in any other category, those basic phonological skills are really important and seem to be especially beneficial, especially for younger students. And that's the same across the board. I believe next, yes. So I have listed these in your YouTube playlist. So these are going to be playing back to back to back before you come back and we finish out our lecture on assessment in this group and instruction, just a few things, and then look back at Najim. But I just encourage you to at least glance at these just to make yourself aware with these programs. And, depending on your school and your district and kind of your classroom placement, especially in student teaching, you might see these presented or not. but these are definitely some well researched options.